Meyer Lansky did not carry a gun. He did not need to, and had not needed to for most of his adult life, because the specific form of power he had built across 4 decades of operating at the center of American organized crime's financial architecture depended on precisely the opposite quality that most of his contemporaries relied on. Where other men built reputations through violence, Lansky built his through arithmetic, through the specific, patient mastery of exactly how money moved, hid, multiplied, and disappeared within the American financial system. A mastery so complete that federal investigators who spent decades trying to convict him of anything substantial largely failed. Not because Lansky was innocent of the activities they suspected, but because he had constructed his operations with a level of financial sophistication that made proving intent, in the specific legal sense prosecutors required, extraordinarily difficult. By 1958, when the events central to this account began, Meyer Lansky had already earned, among the small circle of people positioned to actually understand what he did, the reputation as the single most financially sophisticated figure in American organized crime, a reputation that extended well beyond his formal Jewish American criminal network into genuine respect from Italian-American organizations that, in virtually every other context, maintained strict boundaries around who they considered genuine partners, rather than useful outside contractors. Lansky's specific genius lay not in any single innovation, but in the patient, systematic application of legitimate financial mechanisms to illegitimate purposes, executed with a rigor that most of his contemporaries, more comfortable with the direct application of force than the patient study of banking regulations and corporate law, simply lacked the discipline to match. He had spent decades studying exactly how the American financial system actually functioned, not the version taught in business schools, but the practical, operational reality of how money moved between jurisdictions, how corporate structures could obscure beneficial ownership within entirely legal frameworks, and how the specific gaps between different regulatory agencies, jurisdictions created opportunities that a sufficiently patient and sufficiently disciplined operator could exploit indefinitely without ever technically breaking any single law in a way prosecutors could definitively prove. Bumpy Johnson's path toward Meyer Lansky ran through a problem that had been developing in Harlem's financial infrastructure for several years by 1958. A problem that Bumpy's own considerable financial sophistication had identified but had not, on its own, been sufficient to solve. The numbers operation that Bumpy had built and expanded across 3 decades generated substantial cash revenue, and the specific challenge of moving that cash into forms that could fund the community, investments, legitimate business expansions, and legal defense costs that Bumpy's broader operation required, without creating the kind of traceable financial record that would provide federal prosecutors the evidence they had been seeking for years, had become increasingly difficult as banking regulations and federal financial surveillance capabilities had grown more sophisticated throughout the 1950s. Bumpy had managed this challenge adequately for years through a combination of methods: the legitimate businesses that provided cover for revenue, the careful structuring of the community fund to minimize documentary trails, the relationships with banking officials that Marcus Thompson had cultivated during the Harlem Provident Trust years. But by 1958, the scale of what Bumpy's organization had grown into, combined with the increasing federal attention his reputation attracted, meant that these existing methods were reaching their functional limits. He needed something more sophisticated, a financial architecture capable of handling considerably larger volumes with considerably greater security than what his organization had developed independently. He learned, through the same network of information that kept him current on developments throughout organized crime's various territories, that Meyer Lansky had developed over the preceding 2 decades precisely this kind of sophisticated financial architecture, initially for his own operations centered around gambling interests in Florida, Cuba, and increasingly Las Vegas, but extended, in specific instances where Lansky judged the relationship worthwhile, to other organizations willing to pay for access to his particular expertise. The specific mechanism through which Bumpy initiated contact with Lansky reflected the careful, methodical approach that characterized every significant relationship Bumpy built across his career. Rather than approaching Lansky directly, which would have required an introduction neither man's existing networks naturally provided, Bumpy worked through Frank Costello, whose relationship with Bumpy from the Reinhold collaboration 7 years earlier had matured into exactly the kind of occasional, mutually respectful consultation that made such an introduction possible. Costello, who maintained his own long-standing relationship with Lansky dating back to their shared Prohibition-era bootlegging operations, arranged the introduction in the autumn of 1958, describing Bumpy to Lansky in terms that emphasized precisely the qualities Lansky himself valued most: reliability, sophistication, and the specific kind of long-term thinking that distinguish serious operators from the considerably larger population of criminal figures whose horizons rarely extended beyond their next transaction. Meyer Lansky, in 1958, was 56 years old, a compact man of unremarkable physical presence whose power derived entirely from what existed inside his mind rather than anything visible about his appearance or demeanor. He had emigrated from what is now Belarus as a child, grown up in poverty on New York's Lower East Side, and built, through a combination of genuine mathematical talent and the specific opportunities that Prohibition-era bootlegging provided to ambitious young men willing to take considerable risks, a career that had made him, by the late 1950s, one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in American organized crime, despite never holding the kind of formal leadership position that characterized figures like Luciano, Costello, or the emerging Gambino. They met for the first time in December of 1958 at a hotel in Miami Beach that Lansky maintained significant financial interests in, chosen specifically because it offered the kind of controlled, private environment that both men preferred for consequential conversations, away from the specific surveillance apparatus that New York's federal and local law enforcement had increasingly directed at both their organizations throughout the decade. Bumpy arrived having prepared, as he prepared for every significant negotiation, a comprehensive presentation of exactly what his organization's financial challenges actually were, expressed in the specific, precise language of numbers and mechanisms that he understood. Lansky's particular expertise required, rather than the more general strategic framing that had characterized his approach to negotiations with figures like Luciano or Gambino, whose expertise operated in different registers. Lansky listened to this presentation with the specific, focused attention that colleagues across his career consistently described as his most distinctive professional quality, an ability to process complex financial information with a speed and accuracy that seemed almost mechanical, asking clarifying questions that revealed, within minutes, that he had already identified several structural vulnerabilities in Bumpy's existing financial arrangements that Bumpy's own considerable expertise had not fully recognized. This was, for Bumpy, a genuinely unusual experience. Across nearly 3 decades of building and defending his position in Harlem, He had rarely encountered anyone whose analytical capabilities in a domain he considered his own particular strength exceeded his own so immediately and so obviously, where his previous significant relationships with figures like Luciano and Gambino had been characterized by mutual respect between parties whose expertise operated in genuinely complementary but distinct domains. His initial conversation with Lansky revealed something different. A man whose specific financial sophistication genuinely exceeded Bumpy's own in the particular domain both men were discussing. A recognition that required, from Bumpy, a specific kind of intellectual humility that his reputation and considerable accomplishments rarely required him to exercise. Lansky proposed, within the first 2 hours of their conversation, a restructuring of Bumpy's financial architecture that was considerably more sophisticated than anything Bumpy's own organization had developed independently. The core innovation involved a network of legitimate business interests, structured through a series of holding companies that Lansky's own extensive experience with similar structures in Florida and increasingly in pre-revolutionary Cuba had refined over years of practical application that would allow Harlem's numbers revenue to be gradually converted into legitimate capital through mechanisms sophisticated enough to withstand exactly the kind of federal scrutiny that had begun threatening Bumpy's existing arrangements. The specific mechanics of this structure, as Lansky explained them, involved establishing genuine functioning businesses, not the kind of obvious fronts that provided minimal cover, but genuinely operating enterprises, generating real revenue from real customers, structured through holding companies whose ownership could be documented in ways that satisfied legal scrutiny while still ultimately serving Bumpy's broader financial interests. Lansky described, with the specific technical precision that characterized his entire approach to financial architecture, exactly how similar structures had proven durable against considerable federal investigation in his own operations, identifying the specific documentary practices, banking relationships, and corporate structures that made the difference between arrangements that collapsed under federal scrutiny and arrangements that survived it indefinitely. Bumpy recognized, listening to this explanation, that what Lansky was offering exceeded simple financial advice. It represented access to an entire methodology, refined over decades of practical application across multiple jurisdictions and multiple varieties of federal and state investigation, that Bumpy's organization could not have developed independently within any reasonable time frame, regardless of how much internal financial talent his organization possessed. The negotiation that followed, across the remainder of that initial meeting and 2 subsequent meetings over the following 3 months, addressed the specific terms under which Bumpy's organization would gain access to this methodology and the ongoing relationship this access would require. Lansky, characteristically, approached these terms with the same rigorous, unsentimental precision that characterized every other aspect of his professional conduct. He proposed a fee structure based on a percentage of the capital successfully converted through the new arrangements, rather than a flat consulting fee, a structure that aligned both men's interests directly. Lansky's compensation depended entirely on the arrangement's actual success, rather than simply on providing advice whose implementation and outcomes remained Bumpy's sole responsibility. Bumpy appreciated this structure precisely because it reflected the same principle that had governed his own most successful arrangements across his career, dating back to his original 1935 negotiation with Luciano, that durable partnerships were built on genuinely aligned incentives, rather than transactions where one party's interests were satisfied, regardless of the other's actual outcomes. He accepted Lansky's proposed fee structure with only minor modifications, primarily around the specific timeline over which the percentage-based compensation would be calculated, reflecting Bumpy's own experience that financial arrangements required patience to demonstrate their actual value. Patience that a shorter compensation timeline might inadvertently discourage. The implementation of this restructured financial architecture occupied much of 1959 and 1960, requiring the kind of patient, methodical execution that both men's respective methodologies demanded. Bumpy's organization established for new, legitimate businesses during this period, an import-export company dealing in specialty foods that served the specific, considerable demand within Harlem's West Indian and African American communities for goods not readily available through mainstream distribution channels, a construction and property management firm that took advantage of the accelerating pace of Harlem's building renovation. During this period, a chain of laundromats that expanded significantly beyond the single original establishment that had served as Bumpy's business headquarters since the 1930s, and a specialty printing company that handled, among other legitimate work, considerable volume from Harlem's churches, community organizations, and small businesses. Each of these enterprises was structured following Lansky's specific methodology, through holding companies whose ownership documentation satisfied legal requirements while obscuring, through legitimate legal mechanisms rather than fraudulent concealment, the ultimate beneficial interests that connected them to Bumpy's broader operation. The businesses themselves were required, under the specific discipline Lansky insisted on, to operate as genuinely profitable enterprises independent of any numbers revenue that might eventually flow through them, a requirement that Bumpy's organization satisfied through the kind of careful, community-embedded business practice that had characterized Bumpy's approach to legitimate enterprise since the Harlem Provident Trust years. By 1961, this restructured architecture had demonstrated exactly the durability Lansky had promised. Federal investigators, whose attention to Bumpy's organization had intensified throughout the late 1950s as part of the broader task force efforts that would eventually contribute to Bumpy's 1952 conviction and Alcatraz sentence, found themselves unable to trace the specific connections between Harlem's numbers, revenue, and the legitimate businesses that Lansky's methodology had established, precisely because those connections had been structured to not exist in any documentable, prosecutable form. The businesses generated genuine revenue from genuine operations. Their ownership documentation satisfied every legal requirement federal investigators could apply. The specific mechanisms through which they ultimately served Bumpy's broader financial interests operated through legal structures sophisticated enough that proving criminal intent, the specific legal threshold federal prosecution required, proved beyond what investigators could accomplish despite years of dedicated effort. This success came, ultimately, too late to prevent Bumpy's 1952 conviction and subsequent Alcatraz sentence, which had resulted from evidence gathered before the Lansky restructuring was implemented. But the architecture Lansky had helped establish proved remarkably durable across Bumpy's 11 years of incarceration, managed throughout that period by Mame Johnson and the trusted associates, who had learned Lansky's methodology during the initial implementation years, generating steady, legitimate revenue that helped fund both Bumpy's legal defense during his imprisonment and the continued operation of the community fund that Mame maintained throughout his absence. Meyer Lansky and Bumpy Johnson maintained a working relationship, primarily conducted through periodic consultations that addressed specific, evolving challenges in Bumpy's financial architecture for the remainder of Bumpy's active career following his 1963 release from Alcatraz. This relationship never developed into anything resembling personal friendship in the conventional sense, surviving accounts consistently describe both men's interactions as strictly professional, focused entirely on the specific technical challenges each meeting addressed, without the kind of broader social or political discussion that had characterized Bumpy's relationships with figures like Costello. But this strictly professional character reflected, rather than limited, the specific value both men found in the relationship, which depended entirely on Lansky's particular expertise and required none of the broader political or social coordination that Bumpy's relationships with other organized crime figures had involved. The relationship's significance, viewed within the broader context of Bumpy Johnson's career, illuminates something distinctive about his approach to power that differed even from his relationships with Luciano, Gambino, and Costello, where those relationships had each involved genuine strategic partnership across domains where Bumpy's own expertise remained fully engaged. His relationship with Lansky involved a specific and unusual acknowledgement of another man's superior technical capability in a domain Bumpy had spent decades developing his own considerable expertise within. This acknowledgement, and Bumpy's willingness to act on it by seeking out and compensating Lansky's superior expertise, rather than continuing to rely on his own more limited internal capabilities, reflected a specific quality of intellectual honesty that had characterized his approach to every significant challenge across his career. The recognition that genuine effectiveness required accurately assessing where his own capabilities ended and where seeking external expertise, regardless of the specific humility this required, would produce better outcomes than continued reliance on his own considerable but ultimately bounded abilities. Meyer Lansky's own career would extend considerably beyond Bumpy Johnson's. Continuing through the 1960s and into the 1970s, as Lansky's financial expertise remained in demand across organized crime's evolving landscape, including significant involvement in the pre-revolutionary Cuban gambling industry that collapsed with Castro's 1959 revolution and subsequent involvement in the development of Las Vegas's casino industry throughout the following decades. He died in 1983, having successfully avoided any substantial federal conviction throughout a career that spanned more than 6 decades, a testament to the specific quality of financial sophistication that had made him, in the assessment of virtually every serious historian of American organized crime, the single most successful practitioner of exactly the methodology that Bumpy Johnson had sought out in 1958, the patient, technically sophisticated construction of financial architecture durable enough to withstand sustained federal scrutiny across decades of dedicated investigative effort. The 4 businesses that Bumpy's organization established under Lansky's methodology in 1959 and 1960 outlasted both men, continuing to operate in various forms and under various subsequent ownership structures, well into the following decades, employing generations of Harlem residents in enterprises that had originated as instruments of financial concealment, but that had, through the specific discipline both men had insisted on from the beginning, become genuine, valuable contributors to Harlem's actual economic life, evidence, in their own quiet and unremarked way, that the boundary between legitimate and illegitimate enterprise, in the specific world both men had spent their careers navigating, who was considerably more permeable and considerably more complex than the simpler narratives of criminal activity typically acknowledged. By 1961, this restructured architecture had demonstrated exactly the durability Lansky had promised. But the process of reaching that point required a specific quality of ongoing coordination between the 2 men that extended well beyond their initial meetings. Lansky insisted, throughout the implementation period, on periodic reviews of each new business's actual operational performance, a discipline that reflected his broader philosophy that financial structures designed to withstand federal scrutiny required genuine underlying substance rather than merely convincing paperwork. He reviewed, personally, the profit and loss statements of each of Bumpy's for new enterprises with the same rigor he applied to his own considerably larger portfolio of legitimate and semi-legitimate businesses spanning Florida, Cuba, and the emerging Las Vegas gambling industry. This level of personal attention from a man whose time was by any reasonable measure extraordinarily valuable given the scale of his own operations, was itself a signal that Lansky considered the relationship with Bumpy's organization worth genuine investment rather than a peripheral consulting arrangement he could delegate to subordinates. When asked, decades later, by researchers attempting to reconstruct the relationship's actual dynamics, one of Lansky's former associates, who had occasionally been present during these reviews, described Lansky's engagement with Bumpy's specific financial challenges as notably more personal and more detailed than his typical approach to smaller clients, suggesting that Lansky had recognized in Bumpy something that distinguished him from the considerably larger population of organized crime figures who sought his expertise primarily to solve immediate problems rather than to build genuinely durable, long-term financial architecture. The specific quality that Lansky apparently recognized and valued was Bumpy's willingness to accept the discipline that genuine durability required, even when that discipline imposed costs and complications that a less patient operator might have resisted. When Lansky insisted, for instance, that the specialty printing company Bumpy's organization established maintained genuinely competitive pricing with legitimate competitors rather than relying on captive business from Bumpy's own network to guarantee profitability, Bumpy accepted this constraint despite the additional operational difficulty it created, understanding from his own decades of experience building durable structures in Harlem that genuine substance rather than convenient shortcuts was precisely what would distinguish an arrangement capable of surviving sustained federal scrutiny from one that would collapse the first time investigators looked closely enough. This shared commitment to genuine substance over convenient appearance created, across the specific technical challenges both men worked through together during 1959 and 1960, a working relationship characterized by a level of mutual professional respect that neither man extended casually. Lansky, whose career had brought him into contact with virtually every significant figure in American organized crime across 4 decades, was notably sparing in his praise of other operators' capabilities, reserving genuine respect for the specific quality of disciplined patience that his own career had demonstrated was rarer than raw ambition or even raw intelligence. His assessment of Bumpy Johnson, communicated privately to associates rather than in any public statement, consistently emphasized exactly this quality, that Bumpy understood, in a way that distinguished him from the majority of organized crime figures Lansky had worked with, that genuine financial security required decades of patient discipline rather than any single clever maneuver, however sophisticated. The implementation period also required both men to navigate a specific complication that neither had fully anticipated at their initial meeting: the question of how Bumpy's community fund, the informal but extensive system of support that Bumpy and Mame had built and maintained since the 1930s, would integrate with the more formally structured financial architecture Lansky's methodology required. Lansky's initial instinct, reflecting his own professional experience, was to recommend that the fund's operations remain entirely separate from the new, legitimate business structure, minimizing any documentary connection between the two systems to reduce federal investigators' ability to trace one through evidence of the other. Bumpy resisted this recommendation, explaining to Lansky something that required Lansky, in turn, to understand a dimension of Bumpy's operation that his own experience with more conventionally structured criminal enterprises had not prepared him to fully appreciate. That the community fund was not simply an additional financial obligation to be managed alongside the core business operations, but was, in Bumpy's own assessment, integral to the entire structure's durability, because the community trust and loyalty the fund generated provided a form of protection against exactly the kind of informant vulnerability that had destroyed considerably more sophisticated financial arrangements than anything Bumpy's organization had developed. This was, for Lansky, a genuinely novel consideration, one that required him to expand his own understanding of what durability in an organized crime financial structure actually required. He had spent decades thinking about durability primarily in terms of legal and financial sophistication, the specific mechanisms that could withstand investigative and prosecutorial scrutiny. Bumpy's insistence on integrating community relationship into this calculation introduced a dimension that Lansky's own operations, more heavily weighted toward jurisdictions like Cuba and Nevada, where community relationship in the sense Bumpy meant it played a considerably smaller role, had not required him to develop. The eventual compromise both men reached, worked out across several detailed conversations during early 1959, preserved the fund's essential character and community function while establishing a specific, carefully limited financial connection between it and one of the four new legitimate businesses, the Import-Export Company, whose genuine community service function in supplying goods otherwise unavailable through mainstream channels provided a natural and legally defensible justification for periodic charitable contributions that could, in fact, help sustain the fund's operations without creating the kind of clear financial trail that would have concerned Lansky's more typical operational philosophy. This solution satisfied both men's core concerns, and it represented, in the assessment of people who understood the full complexity of what both men had worked through together, one of the more genuinely collaborative problem-solving processes in either man's career, requiring each to expand his own understanding of what genuine durability actually required beyond the specific expertise each had brought to the relationship independently. Meyer Lansky and Bumpy Johnson's collaboration survived a genuine test in early 1960, when a federal investigator working a separate case against one of Lansky's Cuban gambling interests inadvertently uncovered a document that referenced, in passing and without full context, one of the shell arrangements connected to Bumpy's restructured architecture. This discovery, while ultimately producing no prosecutable evidence because the underlying structure had been built precisely to withstand exactly this kind of partial exposure, nonetheless required both men to coordinate an immediate assessment of how much additional exposure the discovery represented and whether any adjustments to the existing architecture were necessary. Lansky's response to this development demonstrated the specific quality of calm, methodical crisis management that had characterized his entire career. Rather than panicking or recommending dramatic restructuring that might itself attract additional scrutiny, he conducted a careful, systematic review of exactly what the investigator's discovery actually revealed, concluding correctly that the document in question, viewed in isolation and without the broader context that only Lansky and Bumpy possessed, provided investigators no meaningful path toward understanding the actual architecture's full scope or purpose. He recommended no changes to the existing structure, judging that the appearance of stability and continuity was itself protective, communicating to any investigator who might eventually connect the dots that nothing about the co-arrangement suggested awareness of exposure or need for concealment. This assessment proved correct. The investigation that had produced the accidental discovery moved on to other targets within months. Having found nothing in the fragmentary document that justified further pursuit of what actually connected to it, Bumpy's confidence in Lansky's judgment, already substantial based on their prior collaboration, deepened considerably following this episode, providing concrete evidence of exactly the kind of calm, sophisticated crisis management that justified the ongoing relationship's cost. The broader significance of the Bumpy Johnson and Maya Lansky collaboration, when placed alongside Bumpy's other significant relationships with organized crime's most influential figures, illuminates a specific dimension of his overall approach to building durable power that the more commonly discussed confrontations and negotiations sometimes obscure. His relationships with Luciano and Gambino centered on the negotiated terms, governing his own territory's relationship to their broader organizations. His relationship with Costello centered on crisis collaboration when circumstances required combining complementary forms of political sophistication. His relationship with Lansky was different in kind from all of these, a genuine acknowledgement that another man's specific technical expertise in a domain central to Bumpy's own operations survival exceeded what Bumpy's own considerable capabilities could provide, and a willingness to seek out, compensate, and genuinely defer to that expertise despite the specific humility this required, from a man whose reputation rested substantially on his own demonstrated financial sophistication. This willingness to seek external expertise when circumstances genuinely required it, rather than continuing to rely on internal capabilities that had served well enough in the past but were reaching their functional limits, reflects a specific quality of intellectual honesty that distinguished Bumpy Johnson's approach to power from operators whose egos required them to project unlimited self-sufficiency regardless of actual circumstances. He understood, throughout his career, that genuine effectiveness required accurately assessing the boundaries of his own capabilities, and that seeking help across those boundaries, when the stakes justified the specific vulnerability this required, produced considerably better outcomes than the alternative of continued reliance on capabilities that, however considerable, remained ultimately bounded by what any single person, regardless of talent, could develop independently across a single lifetime. Maya Lansky died in 1983 at the age of 80, having successfully avoided any substantial federal conviction throughout a career spanning more than 6 decades. Bumpy Johnson had died 15 years earlier, in 1968. But the specific financial architecture the two men had built together in 1959 and 1960 outlasted both of them by decades, continuing to generate the kind of stable, legitimate revenue that had always been its intended purpose, long after the original criminal motivations that had prompted its creation had become historical footnotes rather than ongoing operational concerns for the businesses themselves. The 4 enterprises Bumpy's organization established under Lansky's methodology represent, in their own quiet and largely unrecognized way, one of the more instructive case studies available for understanding how the boundary between criminal and legitimate enterprise actually functioned in mid-century America, particularly for operators excluded by race from the more conventional pathways toward legitimate capital accumulation that white Americans, including many of Bumpy's own organized crime counterparts, could access through channels simply unavailable to a black entrepreneur in 1950s and 1960s. New York, regardless of his actual business acumen or available capital. This is, perhaps, the deepest significance of the collaboration between Bumpy Johnson and Maya Lansky. Not simply that 2 skilled criminals found mutually profitable ways to work together, but that the specific expertise Lansky provided helped Bumpy accomplish something that the formal American financial and legal system, structured by and for the benefit of people who did not look like him, had never been designed to allow the genuine, durable conversion of capital generated through Harlem's informal economy into legitimate enterprises that employed Harlem residents, served Harlem's genuine needs, and persisted in various forms. For generations after the specific men who had built the arrangement's initial architecture had passed from the scene entirely, evidence that the patient, technical work of building financial durability could accomplish, for a community locked out of legitimate capital access through conventional means, something that no amount of individual talent or determination could achieve without exactly the kind of sophisticated methodology that Meyer Lansky, for reasons of his own professional interest, but with consequences that extended well beyond what either man could have fully anticipated in 1958, made available to Bumpy Johnson when Harlem needed it most.